Chapter 16. Joe had been at the Three Jolly Bargemen smoking his pipe from 8:15 to 10:15. While he was there, my sister had been standing at the kitchen door and had exchanged good night with a farm labourer going home. The man couldn't be more particular as to the time at which he saw her. He got into a dense confusion if he tried, than that it must have been before 9. When Joe went home at 5 minutes after 10, he found her struck down on the floor and promptly called in assistance. The fire had not then burnt unusually low, nor was the snuff of the candle very long. The candle, however, had been blown out. Nothing had been taken away from any part of the house, neither, beyond the blowing of the candle, which stood on the table between the door and my sister, and behind her when she stood facing the fire and was struck, was there any disarrangement of the kitchen, excepting as she herself made in falling and bleeding. But there was one remarkable piece of evidence on the spot. She had been struck with something blunt and heavy on the head and spine. After the blows were dealt, something heavy had been thrown down at her with considerable violence as she lay on her face. And on the ground beside her, when Joe picked it up, was a convict's leg iron, which had been filed. Now, Joe, examining this iron with a smith's eye, declared it to have been filed asunder some time ago. The hue and cry going off to the hulks and people coming thence to examine the iron, Joe's opinion was corroborated. They did not undertake to say when it had left the prison ships, to which it had undoubtedly once belonged, but they claimed to know for certain that the particular manacle had not been worn by either of the two convicts who had escaped last night. Further, one of those had already been taken, and he had not freed himself from his iron. Knowing what I knew, I set up an inference in my own. I believed the iron to be my convict's iron, the iron I had seen and heard him filing at on the marshes, but my mind did not accuse him of having any part in its latest issue. For I believed one of two other persons to have become possessed of it, and to have turned it to this cruel account, either Orlick or the strange man who had shown me the file. Now, as to Orlick, he had gone to town exactly as he told us when we picked him up at the turnpike. He had been seen about town all evening, and he had been in divers companies in several public houses, and he had come back himself with me and Mr. Wopsle. There was nothing against him, save the quarrel, and my sister had quarrelled with him and with everybody else about her 10,000 times. As to the strange man, if he had come back for his 2 banknotes, there could have been no dispute about them, because my sister was fully prepared to restore them. Besides, there had been no altercation. The assailant had come in so silently and suddenly that she had been felled before she could look round. It was horrible to think that I had provided the weapon, however undesignedly, but I could hardly think otherwise. I suffered unspeakable trouble when I considered and reconsidered whether I should at last dissolve the spell of my childhood and tell Joe the whole story. For months afterwards, I every day settled the question finally in the negative and reopened it next morning. The contention came after all to this. The secret was such an old one now. It had grown so into me and become part of myself that I could not tear it away. in addition to the dread that, having led up so much mischief, it would now be more than ever likely to alienate Joe from me if he believed it. I had further the restraining dread that he would not believe it, but would assort it with the fabulous dogs and veal cutlets as a monstrous invention. However, I temporized myself, of course, for I was not wavering between right and wrong when the thing is all what is done. I resolved to make a full disclosure if I should see any such new occasion as a new chance of helping in the discovery of the assailant. The constables and the Bow Street men from London, for this happened in the days of the extinct red waistcoated police, were about the house for a week or two and did pretty much what I have heard and read of like authorities doing in such other cases. They took up several obviously wrong people, and they ran their heads very hard against wrong ideas and persisted in trying to fit the circumstances to the ideas instead of trying to extract the ideas from the circumstances. Also, they stood about the door of the Jolly Bargeman with knowing and reserved looks that filled the whole neighbourhood with admiration, and they had a mysterious manner of taking their drink that was almost as good as taking the culprit. But not quite, for they never did it. Long after these constitutional powers had dispersed, my sister lay very ill in bed. Her sight was disturbed, so that she saw objects multiplied and grasped at visionary teacups and wine glasses instead of the realities. Her hearing was greatly impaired, her memory also, and her speech was unintelligible. When at last she came round, so far as to be helped downstairs, it was still necessary to keep my slate always by her that she might indicate in writing what she could not indicate in speech. As she was, very bad handwriting apart, a more than indifferent speller, and as Joe was a more indifferent than indifferent reader, extraordinary complications arose between them, which I was always called in to solve. The administration of mutton instead of medicine, the substitution of tea for Joe, and the baker for bacon were amongst the mildest of my mistakes. However, her temper was greatly improved, and she was patient. A tremulous uncertainty of action of all her limbs soon became part of her regular state, and afterwards, at intervals of 2 or 3 months, she would often put her hands to her head and would there remain for about a week at a time in some gloomy aberration of mind. We were at a loss to find a suitable attendant for her until a circumstance happened conveniently to resolve it. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt finally conquered a confirmed habit of living into which she had fallen, and Biddy became part of our establishment. It may have been about a month after my sister's reappearance in the kitchen when Biddy came to us with a speckled box containing the whole of her worldly effects, and became a blessing to our household. After all, she was a blessing to Joe, for the dear old fellow was sadly cut up by the constant contemplation of the wreck of his wife, and had been accustomed, while attending her of an evening, to turn to me every now and then and say, his blue eyes moistened, "Such a fine figure of a woman she was once, Pip." Biddy instantly taking the cleverest charge of her as though she had studied her from infancy, Joe became able in some sort to appreciate the greater quiet of his life, and to go down to the Jolly Bargeman now and then for a change that did him good. It was characteristic of the police people that they had all the more or less suspected poor Joe, though he never knew it, and that they had to a man concurred in regarding him as one of their deepest spirits which they had ever encountered. Biddy's first triumph in her new office was to solve a difficulty that had completely vanquished me. I had tried hard at it, but had made nothing of it. Thus it was. Again and again and again, my sister had traced upon the slate a character that looked like a curious T, and then with the utmost eagerness had called our attention to it as something she particularly wanted. I had in vain tried everything producible which began with a T, from tar to toast to tub. At length it had come into my head that the sign looked like a hammer, and on my lustily calling out that word in my sister's ear, she began to hammer on the table and had expressed a qualified assent. Therefore I had brought her all our hammers one after another, but with no avail. Then I bethought me of a crutch, the shape being much the same, and I borrowed one from the village and displayed it to my sister with considerable confidence. But she shook her head to that extent when she was shown it that we were terrified lest in her weak and shattered state she would dislocate her neck. When my sister found that Biddy was very quick to understand her, this mysterious sign reappeared again on the slate. Biddy looked thoughtfully at it, heard my explanation, looked thoughtfully at my sister, looked thoughtfully at Joe, who always represented on the slate by his initial letter, and ran into the forge, followed by Joe and me. "Why, of course!" cried Biddy with an exultant face. "Don't you see? It's him! Orlick, without a doubt." She had lost his name and could only signify him by his hammer. We told him why he wanted to come into the kitchen, and he slowly laid down his hammer, wiped his brow with his arm, took another wipe at it with his apron, and came slouching out with a curious loose vagabond bend in the knee that strongly distinguished him. I confess that I expected to see my sister denounce him, and that I was disappointed by the different result. She manifested the greatest anxiety to be on good terms with him, was evidently much pleased by his being at length produced, and motioned that she would have him given something to drink. She watched his countenance as if it were particularly wishful to be assured that he took kindly to his reception. She showed every possible desire to conciliate him, and there was an air of humble propitiation in all that she did, such as I have seen pervade the bearing of a child towards a hard master. After that, a day rarely passed without her drawing the hammer on her slate, and without Orlick slouching in and standing doggedly before her, as if he knew no more than I did what to make of it.